Jake's heart raced as the alien stares bored into his back, the first human to dare tread the hallowed halls of the Galactic Academy. If he failed here, humanity's already shaky galactic reputation was totally screwed. But that's what the Zenari wanted, right? The bug-faced bastards had been spreading rumors about primitive, violent humans ever since first contact. At 6'2", with big muscles from high-gravity workouts, Jake towered over his insectoid classmates. Anxious whispers of, "Look at that huge ape," and "Careful, it might go apeshit and kill us all," reached his ears. One tall, jewel-eyed Zenari glared at Jake with unhidden disgust. "Well, well, if it isn't the human ambassador," he sneered. "Juno, son of the esteemed Zekzik broodline, let's see if your species' feeble intellect can even grasp basic galactic history." The hush fell as Jake entered the classroom, a million compound eyes dissecting him. This was it, humanity's first impression. Jake steeled himself and approached the learning podium. Time to show these arrogant bugs what a human could do. Everything rode on this: the respect of galactic society, the right to expand beyond the Sol system, the chance to explore the stars as equals. Jake just had to ace his classes, while surrounded by aliens who thought his kind were knuckle-dragging primitives, in a school with no human friends, tailored to alien physiology and culture. As Jake stepped up to the learning podium, the room fell deathly silent. 1,000 compound eyes stared at him, dissecting his every move. Dr. Xyloth, a towering Zenari with razor-sharp mandibles, gestured for Jake to speak. "Well, human, enlighten us about your species' history," Dr. Xyloth said, his voice cold and clinical. Jake cleared his throat, his heart pounding. "One of humanity's most impressive achievements was the construction of the ancient Egyptian pyramids," he began, his voice echoing in the cavernous classroom. "These massive structures were built with advanced engineering techniques, requiring incredible precision and skill." A snicker cut through the room. Jake turned to see Juno, the jewel-eyed Zenari, sneering at him. "Advanced engineering? More like primitive slave labor," Juno scoffed. "Everyone knows humans are too stupid to build something like that on their own." The class erupted in laughter, a cacophony of clicking and buzzing. Jake felt his face burn with humiliation. Juno shrugged, his exoskeleton glinting in the harsh classroom light. "It's just what I've heard," he said dismissively. Jake clenched his fists, anger and embarrassment warring inside him. He knew Juno's comment was based on nothing but prejudice and misinformation, but how could he prove it? As the class continued, Jake noticed that Dr. Xyloth's lecture focused almost entirely on the Zenari's technological achievements. He spoke at length about their advanced spacefaring capabilities, their mastery of genetic engineering, and their role in shaping the galaxy. But there was barely any mention of other species' contributions. No discussion of the Zorgon's groundbreaking medical advances or the Quilarians' unparalleled artistic achievements. Her sinking feeling settled in Jake's gut. Was the Academy's curriculum biased towards the Zenari? Were they deliberately downplaying the accomplishments of other species to make themselves look superior? As Dr. Xyloth droned on about yet another Zenari invention, Jake felt a growing sense of unease. He had come to the Academy to prove that humans were just as capable as any other species in the galaxy. But now, surrounded by hostile classmates and a potentially biased curriculum, he wondered if he had any chance of succeeding. The weight of his mission pressed down on him, suffocating and inescapable. He glanced around the room, taking in the sea of alien faces. Some looked bored, others openly hostile. Juno caught his eye and smirked, as if to say, "You don't belong here, human." Jake swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. He had to find a way to prove himself, to show that humans were more than just primitive savages. But as the class wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that the deck was stacked against him, that no matter how hard he tried, he would always be seen as inferior, as less than. After the disastrous galactic history class, Jake's stomach churned as he trudged into the vast school cafeteria. The cavernous space buzzed with 1,000 alien conversations, a dizzying cacophony of clicks, hums, and strange vocalizations. The other species huddled at the fringes of the room, as far from the Zanari as possible. Jake spotted a group of Zorgons, their bulbous heads bobbing as they slurped gelatinous cubes. A trio of Quillarians perched nearby, their iridescent feathers shimmering under the harsh cafeteria lights. But there were no humans. Jake was utterly alone. Sighing, he chose an empty table near the edge of the room and sat down heavily. A robotic server whirred over and deposited a tray of greyish paste in front of him, a nutrient-dense meal designed for human consumption. Jake poked at it listlessly with his spork. As he forced himself to take a bite, he felt a presence behind him. Jake tensed, bracing for another confrontation, but when he turned, he saw not a sneering Zanari, but a small, furry creature with huge, soulful eyes. "Mind if I join you?" the creature asked, its voice high and melodic. "I'm Xander, the only Zephyrian in this place." Jake blinked in surprise. "Sure," he said, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. "I'm Jake, the only human." Xander's ears flattened against his head. "It's not just the teasing," he whispered. "Juno and his crew, they're known for their vicious pranks and hazing rituals. They once shaved a Quillarian student bald while he slept. Poor guy was traumatized." Xander shook his head sadly. "The faculty turns a blind eye," he said. "The Zanari have too much influence here." Suddenly, a commotion erupted at a nearby table. Jake whipped around to see one of Juno's cronies dangling a terrified Zephyrian student by the tail, jabbing at the poor creature with a sharpened utensil. The Zephyrian squealed in pain and fear, its little paws flailing helplessly. Rage surged through Jake's veins. He leapt to his feet, fully intending to march over and give that sadistic Zanari a piece of his mind. But Xander lunged across the table and grabbed Jake's arm, his claws digging into Jake's skin. "Don't," Xander pleaded, his eyes wide and desperate. "You'll only make it worse for yourself and for that poor kid. The Zanari will make your life hell." Jake hesitated, torn between his desire to help and the sinking realization that Xander was probably right. Slowly, reluctantly, he sank back into his seat, his heart heavy with impotent anger and frustration. He could only watch as the bully finally released the sobbing Zephyrian, who scampered away in abject terror. The Zanari's cruel laughter rang in Jake's ears, mingling with the buzz of 100 alien conversations. In that moment, Jake realized the true nature of the Galactic Academy's social hierarchy. It wasn't just about academic success or intellectual prowess, it was about power, pure and simple. And right now, the Zanari held all the cards. Jake clenched his fists under the table, his mind racing. He couldn't just sit back and let this injustice continue, but what could one lone human do against an entrenched system of cruelty and bigotry? As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Jake trudged out of the classroom, his mind still reeling from the day's events. The weight of his mission and the hostility of his classmates bore down on him like a physical burden. Xander scurried up beside him, his furry face etched with concern. "Rough day, huh?" he asked, falling into step with Jake as they made their way towards the dormitories. Xander's ears perked up. "Hey, I have an idea," he said, his voice brightening. "Why don't you come with me to the VR gaming room? It's a great place to unwind and forget about your troubles for a while." Jake hesitated, torn between his desire to escape his problems and his fear of making a fool of himself in front of more alien students. But the thought of spending another evening alone in his dorm room, brooding over his failure, was too depressing to contemplate. "Sure," he said, forcing a smile. "Lead the way." The VR gaming room was a cavernous space, filled with sleek high-tech pods that resembled futuristic coffins. Jake and Xander climbed into adjacent pods, and the lids hissed shut, plunging them into darkness. Moments later, they found themselves in the cockpit of a sleek silver spacecraft, hurtling through the inky void of space. Stars glittered in the distance, and a massive asteroid field loomed ahead, a treacherous obstacle course of jagged rocks and spinning debris. Xander grinned, his paws flying over the controls. "Ready to show these rocks who's boss?" he asked, his voice crackling over the comm system. Jake nodded, gripping the weapons console with sweaty palms. Together they plunged into the asteroid field, weaving and dodging through the deadly maze with heart-stopping precision. For a moment, Jake almost forgot his troubles, lost in the thrill of the game, but then, without warning, another ship materialized behind them, its sleek black hull bristling with advanced weaponry. "Well, well, well," a familiar voice drawled over the comm. "Look who it is, the primitive primate and his furry little friend." Jake's blood ran cold. It was Juno, flanked by his Zanari cronies, their faces twisted into cruel sneers. "Let's see how well you dance, human," Juno hissed, and then all hell broke loose. Juno's ship was a marvel of alien technology, equipped with shields and weapons far beyond anything Jake had ever seen. The Zanari flew circles around Jake and Xander, peppering their ship with laser fire and mocking laughter. "Is that the best you can do, monkey boy?" Juno taunted, his voice dripping with contempt. "No wonder your species is stuck on that backwater planet of yours." Jake gritted his teeth, his fingers flying over the weapons console. He locked onto Juno's ship, his thumb hovering over the trigger. Xander yelped as a barrage of missiles slammed into their shields, sending shudders through the ship. "We can't take much more of this," he cried, his voice tight with panic. But Jake barely heard him. A cold, focused rage had settled over him, a clarity of purpose that cut through the fear and doubt. He remembered the Zephyrian student dangling helplessly from the Zanari bully's grasp. He remembered the laughter that had followed him from Dr. Xyloth's classroom, the whispers that said he would never belong. No more. He was done being pushed around, done being underestimated. He was a human, damn it, and it was time to show these arrogant bugs what that meant. His fingers danced over the console, rerouting power from the shields to the weapons. The ship shuddered and groaned, but Jake ignored it, his eyes locked on Juno's vessel as it swooped in for another pass. "Closer, closer, now!" Jake slammed his fist down on the trigger, and a barrage of missiles erupted from their ship, streaking towards Juno like vengeful comets. The Zanari tried to evade, but it was too late. The missiles slammed into his ship, one after another, ripping through shields and hull alike. Juno's ship reeled back, trailing smoke and sparks. "What the hell?" he snarled, his voice tight with shock and fury. "How did you—" But Jake was already firing again, his face set in a mask of grim determination. Missiles pounded Juno's vessel, hammering it from every angle until it was little more than a battered, limping wreck. "Retreat!" Juno screamed, his voice shrill with rage and humiliation. "Retreat, damn you!" The Zanari ship lurched away, fleeing into the depths of the asteroid field. Jake watched it go, his heart pounding with a fierce, exultant pride. But as the adrenaline faded, a cold sense of dread settled in his gut. He had won the battle, but at what cost? He had just humiliated the most popular student in school, a Zanari with powerful connections and a vicious streak a mile wide. As they climbed out of the VR pods, Juno was waiting for them, his jewel-like eyes blazing with fury. "This isn't over, human," he hissed, jabbing a spindly finger at Jake's chest. "You think you're so clever, don't you? But you just made the biggest mistake of your life." With that, he spun on his heel and stalked away, his cronies trailing behind him like obedient dogs. Xander turned to Jake, his furry face creased with worry. "Jake," he whispered, "what have you done?" Jake swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. He had won the battle, but he had a sinking feeling that the war was just beginning, and this time the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. The next day, Jake entered the xenobiology lab with a sense of trepidation. The stark white walls and gleaming metal tables felt cold and sterile, a far cry from the warmth of his high school biology classroom back on Earth. Dr. Xylax, a tall, spindly Zanari with piercing compound eyes, surveyed the students with a stern gaze. "Today you will be working in pairs to dissect a preserved Zephyrian specimen," he announced, his voice sharp and clinical. "I expect you to conduct yourselves with the utmost professionalism." Jake's heart sank as Dr. Xylax began to read out the pairings. Please, not Juno, he thought desperately. Anyone but him. But the universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. "Jake and Juno," Dr. Zylax said, his tone brooking no argument. Jake risked a glance at Juno, who was glaring at him with undisguised contempt. The Zanari's jewel-like eyes glittered with malice, and Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. Reluctantly, he made his way to Juno's table, where a small furry form lay motionless on a metal tray. The Zephyrian specimen looked so fragile, its once vibrant fur now dull and matted. Jake felt a pang of sorrow for the poor creature, so far from its home and reduced to nothing more than a learning tool. Juno picked up a scalpel, the sharp blade glinting under the harsh laboratory lights. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. As they began the dissection, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Juno was up to something. The Zanari's movements were too precise, too deliberate, as if he were waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Jake stared in horror at the gash on his hand, watching as his red blood mingled with the Zephyrian's blue ichor. The colors swirled together in a sickening kaleidoscope, a twisted reminder of the gulf between their species. Dr. Zylax materialized at their table, his compound eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "What happened here?" he demanded, his voice sharp with displeasure. Dr. Zylax turned to Jake, who was cradling his injured hand against his chest. "Go to the infirmary," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Get that wound treated." Jake nodded, too shaken to speak. He gathered his things and stumbled out of the lab, his vision blurring at the edges. As he made his way down the hallway, a wave of dizziness washed over him. The walls seemed to tilt and spin, and he felt his gorge rising in his throat. His heart raced, pounding against his ribs like a caged animal desperate for escape. Suddenly his legs gave out beneath him. He crashed to the floor, his body convulsing in violent spasms. Pain ripped through his muscles, and he tasted blood on his tongue. Through the haze of agony, he saw a group of students gathering around him, their faces a blur of colors and shapes. Their voices sounded distant and distorted, as if he were hearing them from underwater. And then, just before the darkness claimed him, he saw Juno's face looming above him. The Zanari's lips were twisted in a cruel smile, his eyes glinting with a secret knowledge that chilled Jake to his very core. Pain. That was the first thing Jake felt as he slowly regained consciousness. His head throbbed mercilessly, his vision blurred and unfocused. He blinked, trying to clear the haze from his eyes, and found himself staring up at a sterile, white ceiling. "Ah, you're awake," a gentle voice said from beside him. Jake turned his head, wincing at the stiffness in his neck, and saw a kind-looking Zephyrian woman standing next to his bed. She had soft, fluffy fur and large, expressive eyes that radiated warmth and concern. "Where am I?" Jake croaked, his throat dry and scratchy. Jake frowned, trying to remember what had happened. Images flashed through his mind. Juno's smirking face, the gleam of a scalpel, the sharp sting of pain in his hand. He shuddered, a wave of nausea washing over him. "How long was I out?" he asked, trying to sit up. A strange metallic taste filled his mouth and his fingers tingled uncomfortably. Zara placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, easing him back down onto the bed. "Several hours," she said, her brow furrowed with concern. "The medication we gave you can cause some side effects, like the taste in your mouth and the tingling sensation. It's nothing to worry about." Zara smiled, patting his arm reassuringly. "Of course, get some sleep, Jake. You'll feel better soon." Jake let his eyes drift closed, the world fading away as he slipped back into a dreamless sleep. When Jake woke again, the infirmary was quiet and empty. He sat up gingerly, pleased to find that his head no longer ached and his vision had cleared. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, testing his balance before standing up. He made his way out of the infirmary, his steps slow and careful. The hallways were deserted, the only sound the soft hum of the ventilation system. Jake glanced at his watch, surprised to see that it was late in the evening. He'd slept through the entire day. As he turned a corner, he nearly collided with a small, furry figure. "Jake!" Xander exclaimed, his eyes wide with relief. "You're okay!" Xander's ears flattened against his head, his expression turning serious. "There's been a lot of talk," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure they were alone. "Some students think that Juno might have cut you on purpose." Jake's blood ran cold, a shiver running down his spine. "On purpose?" he repeated, his heart beginning to race. "But why would he do that?" Xander shrugged, his tail twitching nervously. "I don't know, but you know how Juno is. He's always looking for ways to make people miserable." Jake's hands clenched into fists, anger and confusion warring in his chest. He couldn't believe that Juno would go so far as to intentionally harm him. But then again, the Zanari had made it clear from day one that he despised Jake and everything he represented. Xander's eyes widened in alarm. "Jake, no," he pleaded, grabbing Jake's arm. "That's a terrible idea. Juno's dangerous. Who knows what he might do?" He turned and strode down the hallway, ignoring Xander's protests. He knew the Zephyrian was right, that confronting Juno was a risk, but he couldn't stand the thought of the Zanari getting away with something so vicious and cruel. He found Juno in the common room, lounging on a sleek black couch with his usual entourage of Zanari friends. They were laughing and joking, their voices carrying across the room with an air of arrogant superiority. Jake marched up to them, his heart pounding in his ears. Juno looked up as he approached, his jewel-like eyes narrowing with a mix of amusement and disdain. "Well, well, look who's back from the dead," Juno sneered, his mandibles clicking together in a mocking approximation of a human smile. "I heard you had a little trouble in the lab. I guess humans aren't as tough as they think they are." Jake's hands shook with barely contained rage, his nails digging into his palms. "Did you do it on purpose?" he demanded, his voice tight and strained. "Did you cut me intentionally?" But there was something in Juno's expression, a glint of malicious satisfaction that made Jake's skin crawl. He knew with a sickening certainty that the Zanari was lying. "I don't believe you," Jake said flatly, his eyes locked on Juno's. "You're hiding something." Juno's face hardened, his posture shifting from languid amusement to coiled aggression. "Watch your tone, human," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Jake opened his mouth to retort, but something in Juno's eyes made him hesitate. There was a darkness there, a sinister knowledge that chilled him to the bone. He turned and walked away, his heart racing and his mind reeling. He could feel Juno's gaze boring into his back, heavy with unspoken threats and dark promises. As he left the common room, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he had just made a terrible mistake, that by confronting Juno, he had set something in motion that he couldn't control. He shivered, wrapping his arms around himself as he hurried back to his dorm. The academy suddenly felt colder, more hostile than ever before, and deep down, Jake knew that his troubles were far from over. Over the next few days, Jake kept a close eye on his body, searching for any changes. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary, but then, during a particularly boring lecture on the mating habits of the Zorgans, he found himself able to hear the whispered conversation of two Zanari students on the other side of the massive lecture hall. "Did you hear about the initiation tonight?" one of them said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "I heard it's going to be even more intense than last year's." "I can't wait," the other replied, a hint of excitement in his voice. "I've been looking forward to this all semester." Jake frowned, straining to hear more, but the conversation was drowned out by the droning of the professor, and he was left with more questions than answers. As the days went on, Jake's senses only grew sharper. He found himself able to see in near total darkness, his eyes picking up even the faintest hint of light. His reflexes, too, seemed to have improved, allowing him to react with lightning speed to any situation. At first, Jake was thrilled by these new abilities. He thought they would give him an edge in his classes, help him to better navigate the treacherous social hierarchy of the academy. But as he listened in on more and more conversations, he began to realize that his enhanced senses were picking up on disturbing details that he had previously been unaware of. He overheard whispers of a secret society within the academy, one that was involved in dark, forbidden practices. The Zenari students spoke of strange rituals and ancient artifacts, of powers that were beyond the understanding of mere mortals. Even the professors seemed to be in on it. Jake noticed that Dr. Zylax and some of the other faculty members would often stop talking abruptly when he entered a room, as if they were hiding something from him. Late one night, as Jake lay in bed, his mind racing with questions and fears, he heard something that made his blood run cold. It was a strange, rhythmic chanting, coming from somewhere deep within the walls of the academy. The language was unlike anything he had ever heard before, guttural and ancient. It filled him with a sense of dread and foreboding, as if he were hearing something that he was never meant to hear. Jake sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he should just ignore it, pretend he hadn't heard anything. But his curiosity got the better of him. He had to know what was going on. Slowly, carefully, he slipped out of bed and crept out of his dorm room. The halls of the academy were dark and silent, the only sound the soft padding of his bare feet on the cold metal floor. He followed the chanting, his enhanced hearing guiding him through the maze of corridors. As he rounded a corner, he came face to face with a hooded figure. Its eyes glowed a deep, malevolent red, and Jake felt a shiver run down his spine. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could get a word out, the figure raised a hand. Jake felt an invisible force slam into his chest, sending him flying backwards into the wall. The air was knocked from his lungs, and he gasped for breath, his vision swimming. He looked up, expecting to see the figure advancing on him, but it was gone, vanished into the shadows as if it had never been there at all. Jake struggled to his feet, his mind reeling. What the hell was going on? Who was that figure, and what did they want with him? He had a feeling that he was stumbling onto something much bigger and much more dangerous than he had ever imagined. But there was no turning back now. He had to find out the truth, no matter the cost. Jake took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever lay ahead. He had a feeling that he was about to be plunged into a world of secrets and lies, of ancient evils and hidden agendas, and he had no idea if he would make it out alive. Jake stumbled back to his dorm room, his mind reeling from the encounter with the hooded figure. His heart pounded against his ribs as he slammed the door shut behind him, leaning against it for support. Jake took a shaky breath, running a trembling hand through his hair. "I think I just did," he whispered, his voice hoarse with fear. "Xander, there's something seriously wrong with this place." Xander's eyes widened, his furry face creasing with worry. "What do you mean?" he asked, sitting down on the edge of Jake's bed. Jake paced the room, his thoughts racing. "I heard this chanting coming from somewhere deep in the academy," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "And then I saw this figure in a hooded robe. Its eyes were glowing red, and it had this power." Xander's ears flattened against his head, his tail twitching nervously. "Jake," he said slowly, his voice low and serious, "I think you might have stumbled onto something dangerous. There are rumors, whispers of a secret Zenari cult that practices dark rituals and sacrifices." Xander nodded, his expression grim. "Some students who have crossed the cult have disappeared under mysterious circumstances," he said quietly. "No one knows what happens to them." "I have to confront Dr. Zylax," he said, his voice hardening with determination. "He knows something about this, I'm sure of it." Xander's eyes widened in alarm. "Jake, no," he pleaded, grabbing Jake's arm. "That's too dangerous. You don't know what you're dealing with." But Jake shook off Xander's grip, his jaw set with resolve. "I can't just sit back and do nothing," he said firmly. "If there's a chance that Dr. Zylax is involved in something this twisted, I have to find out the truth." Without waiting for Xander's response, Jake strode out of the room, his heart hammering in his chest. He made his way through the deserted hallways, his footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. He reached Dr. Zylax's office and pushed open the door, his palms slick with sweat. The room was empty, the lights dimmed and the air heavy with a strange, musty scent. Jake's eyes darted around the room, searching for any clue or sign of the professor's involvement. His gaze fell on the desk, and he noticed a small, almost imperceptible seam in the wood. With shaking fingers, He pried open the hidden compartment, his breath catching in his throat. Inside, nestled in a bed of black velvet, was a strange, pulsating crystal, its surface swirling with an otherworldly energy. Beside the crystal lay a stack of ancient-looking texts, their pages yellowed and brittle with age. The script was unfamiliar, a series of intricate symbols and glyphs that seemed to writhe and twist before Jake's eyes. Suddenly the door slammed shut behind him, the sound like a gunshot in the stillness. Jake whirled around, his heart leaping into his throat. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway outside, growing louder with each passing second. A sense of pure, unadulterated terror gripped Jake's heart, squeezing the breath from his lungs. The door burst open, the wood splintering under the force of the blow. Dr. Zylax stood in the doorway, flanked by two hooded figures, their eyes glowing with the same malevolent red as the figure from the hallway. "You have meddled in affairs beyond your comprehension, human," Dr. Zylax hissed, his voice dripping with menace. "Now you will pay the price for your curiosity." The hooded figures advanced on Jake, their hands crackling with dark energy. Jake's mind raced, desperate for a way out. And then, something inside him clicked. He felt a surge of power, a rush of energy that flowed through his veins like liquid fire. Without thinking, he launched himself at the window, his newfound strength propelling him forward. The glass shattered under the force of his impact, and he felt himself falling, plummeting towards the ground below. As he fell, he saw the hooded figures peering down at him from the office window, their eyes burning with hatred and malice. Jake slammed into the ground with a bone-jarring thud, pain lancing through his body. But even as he gasped for breath, he could feel his enhanced physiology already beginning to knit his injuries back together. He stumbled to his feet, casting a wary glance back at the academy. He had to get out of here, had to find someone who would believe his story. Ignoring the throbbing in his limbs, Jake limped away from the school grounds, his mind racing with the implications of what he had discovered. The city was a sprawling metropolis of gleaming spires and bustling streets, a far cry from the dark secrets that lurked within the academy's walls. Jake made his way to the local law enforcement headquarters, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. But as he poured out his story to the skeptical officers, he realized with a sinking feeling that the cult's influence extended far beyond the school. The police exchanged disbelieving looks, their eyes hardening with suspicion. "Listen, kid," one of them said, his tone patronizing. "You're just a human. You don't know what you're talking about. The Zenari are respected members of our society. They wouldn't be involved in anything like what you're describing." Jake's protests fell on deaf ears. The officers dismissed him with a wave of their hands, leaving him standing alone in the sterile lobby, his heart heavy with despair. He couldn't go back to the academy. Not now, not when Dr. Zylax and his hooded minions were surely hunting for him. Jake had no choice but to go into hiding, to find a place where he could nurse his wounds and plan his next move. The motel room was small and dingy, the air thick with the stench of stale smoke and cheap cleaning chemicals. Jake sat on the edge of the sagging bed, his head in his hands. He couldn't shake the image of those glowing red eyes, the feel of that invisible force slamming into his chest. But as he began to sift through the jumbled pieces of the puzzle, a picture started to emerge. The cult wasn't just a group of rogue Zenari. It was a vast, galaxy-spanning organization, with tendrils that reached into the highest echelons of power. And at the center of it all was that crystal, the one he had found hidden in Dr. Zylax's office. Jake didn't know what it was, but he could feel its power, its significance. If the cult got their hands on it, if they used it in their twisted ritual. Jake shuddered to think of the consequences. He had to stop them, had to find a way to destroy the crystal before it was too late. With trembling fingers, he reached for his communicator, punching in the code for the only person he trusted in this whole mess. "Xander," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and fear. "It's Jake. I need your help." "Xander," Jake whispered hoarsely into his communicator. "It's time. Meet me at the entrance to the sublevels in 10 minutes. "On my way," came Xander's terse reply. The line went dead. Jake pocketed the device and took a deep breath, his heart pounding. This was it, their one chance to stop the cult's twisted plans. He had to get his hands on that crystal and destroy it before it was too late. He crept through the Academy's darkened halls, his senses on high alert. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden threat, every sound a potential warning. But he pushed forward, driven by a grim determination. At the entrance to the sublevels, Xander materialized out of the darkness, his fur standing on end. "You ready?" he asked, his voice tight with tension. Jake nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Together they slipped through the hidden door and descended into the depths of the Academy. The air grew colder as they went deeper, the walls slick with moisture. An oppressive sense of dread settled over them, a physical weight that seemed to grow heavier with each step. And then they saw it, a vast cavernous chamber, lit by an eerie pulsing light. Ancient artifacts lined the walls, their surfaces etched with strange symbols that seemed to writhe and twist before their eyes. But it was the altar at the center of the room that drew their gaze like a magnet. Atop it, glowing with a sickly, otherworldly light, was the crystal Jake had found in Dr. Xylax's office. They approached cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the stillness. But as they drew near, a figure emerged from the shadows, Dr. Xylax, flanked by a group of hooded cultists. "You fools," the professor hissed, his eyes blazing with madness. "You have no idea what you're meddling with." Jake and Xander exchanged a glance, a silent communication passing between them. And then, as one, they launched themselves at the cultists. It was a fierce, desperate battle, fought with tooth and claw and the strange newfound powers that coursed through Jake's veins. He lashed out with blinding speed, his blows fueled by a strength he hadn't known he possessed. Beside him, Xander was a blur of fur and fury, his small form darting between the cultists' legs, tripping them up and leaving them vulnerable to Jake's attacks. For a moment, it seemed they might actually win. The cultists fell back, their ranks thinning under the onslaught. Jake felt a surge of hope, a wild, reckless belief that they could actually pull this off. And then a voice cut through the chaos, cold and mocking. "Well done, Jake, you've played your part perfectly." Jake spun around, his heart dropping into his stomach. There, standing at the edge of the chamber, was Juno, or rather the being that had been posing as Juno all along. "You," Jake breathed, his voice shaking with a mixture of rage and horror. "It was you all along." Juno, no, the shadow, smiled, a twisted, cruel thing. "Of course," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "Did you really think a mere Zanari could have orchestrated all of this?" He gestured to the crystal, which was now pulsing with an almost blinding intensity. "All of this just to bring you here, Jake. The perfect vessel, the key to unleashing my master upon this pathetic reality." Jake's mind reeled, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. The accident in the lab, the changes to his body and mind, it had all been part of the Shadow's plan, a way to shape him into the ideal conduit for the crystal's power. And now, with the crystal fully charged and Jake standing before it, the final piece was in place. The Shadow began to chant, his voice rising in a crescendo of twisted syllables and eldritch phrases. Jake felt the crystal's power surging through him, a searing, agonizing force that threatened to tear him apart from the inside out. He screamed, his body convulsing as the Shadow's laughter echoed in his ears. But through the pain, through the chaos and the madness, Jake clung to one last desperate thought. He couldn't let this happen, couldn't let the Shadow win. With a final Herculean effort, he lunged forward, his fingers closing around the crystal's jagged edges. The pain was indescribable, a white-hot agony that seared through every nerve and synapse. But he held on, even as the Shadow's screams of rage and disbelief filled the chamber. With a wordless cry of defiance, Jake wrenched the crystal free from its altar and hurled it into the depths of the chamber. The effect was instantaneous. The crystal shattered, releasing a massive burst of energy that engulfed the Shadow and the remaining cultists. The chamber shook and trembled, cracks spreading across the walls and ceiling. Jake nodded, his vision blurring as he staggered towards the exit. Behind them, the chamber collapsed in on itself, burying the Shadow and his minions beneath tons of rubble. They barely made it out before the entire sub-level caved in, the ground shaking beneath their feet as they stumbled into the open air. Around them, the academy was in ruins, its once proud towers reduced to piles of smoking debris. In the distance, sirens wailed as emergency crews raced to the scene. Jake and Xander stood amidst the destruction, their bodies battered and their minds reeling. They had won, but at what cost? In the days that followed, they were hailed as heroes by the galactic community, their bravery and sacrifice celebrated across the stars. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that their victory was a hollow one. The academy was gone, and with it, any hope of bridging the gap between humans and Zanari. The revelation of the cult's infiltration had shattered any trust between the two species, leaving only bitterness and recrimination in its wake. As Jake stood on a hilltop overlooking the ruins of the academy, he couldn't help but feel a sense of profound loss. Everything he had worked for, everything he had believed in, had been a lie. Jake turned away from the wreckage, his heart heavy with the weight of all that had been lost. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: the galaxy would never be the same. With a heavy sigh, he shouldered his pack and set off down the hill, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. It was time to start a new chapter, to find a new path amidst the wreckage of the old. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.